It hit without warning. The JMA, Japan Meteorological Agency, registered it before the shaking reached Tokyo. 3 seconds. That was the warning time for communities closest to the epicenter. 3 seconds, not minutes, not hours. 3 seconds. By the time the alert reached phones, the ground was already moving. And now, in the hours and days that have followed, the aftershocks keep coming. Not slowing, not spacing out the way the models predict. Coming. And here's the question that no press briefing from the JMA has answered directly. Is the biggest earthquake of the year the event? Or is it the warning? Here is what this video covers. Japan has the best earthquake monitoring system on Earth. More seismometers per square kilometer than any nation in history. An early warning system, the earthquake early warning, that has been operational since 2007. The most sophisticated real-time seismic alert network ever built. And yet, 3 seconds. That was the warning window for the communities closest to this week's epicenter. 3 seconds is not enough to evacuate a building, not enough to stop a train, not enough to shut down a surgical procedure, not enough to do almost anything that the warning exists to enable. And here's the detail that changes how you read everything that follows. Japan's early warning system was not designed to give you time to run. It was designed to give automated systems time to react. Train brakes, elevator stops, factory shutdowns, gas line closures, the system works. It saves lives. It does exactly what it was built to do. What it cannot do, what no system on Earth can do, is tell you whether the earthquake that just ended is the largest earthquake of this sequence, or the smallest. Stay with me, because the aftershocks arriving right now are not the story. The question of whether they are aftershocks is the story. The Japan Meteorological Agency operates a seismic observation network of approximately 4,000 stations across the Japanese archipelago. High-sensitivity seismometers, broadband seismometers, accelerometers, ocean-bottom seismometers positioned along the seafloor off Japan's Pacific coast. When this week's earthquake struck, the network registered it simultaneously across hundreds of stations. The waveforms told the JMA the magnitude immediately, the location within seconds, the depth within minutes. The early warning alert went out before the S waves, the slower, more destructive secondary waves, reached populated areas further from the epicenter. That is the system working. Exactly as designed, exactly as tested, exactly as the engineers who built it over decades intended it to work. The Shinkansen network, Japan's high-speed rail system operating at speeds up to 320 km/h, received the alert and began automated braking procedures. No derailments, no collisions. The train slowed. The passengers felt the braking before they felt the shaking. That is 17 years of engineering functioning in seconds. Now here is what the JMA's 4,000 stations cannot tell anyone. Whether the fault that produced this week's earthquake has finished moving, whether the stress released by the main shock has redistributed to adjacent segments in a way that increases their probability of rupturing, whether the aftershock sequence now being recorded, dozens of smaller earthquakes following the main event in the hours and days after, will decay the way aftershock sequences are supposed to decay, or whether one of those aftershocks will turn out, in retrospect, not to be an aftershock at all. There is a word in seismology that scientists use only in retrospect: foreshock. A foreshock is an earthquake that precedes a larger earthquake on the same fault system. It looks identical to any other earthquake. Same waveform, same depth signal, same aftershock sequence that begins developing after it. You cannot distinguish a foreshock from a standalone earthquake at the time it occurs. You can only identify it after the larger event arrives, because only then does it become clear that what you thought was the main shock was the preparation for something else. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake, magnitude 9. 0, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, the earthquake that generated the tsunami that killed 19,500 people and caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, was preceded by a foreshock. On March 9, 2011, 2 days before the main event, a magnitude 7, 3 earthquakes struck off the Pacific coasts of the Tohoku region. At the time, it was the biggest earthquake Japan had experienced in several years. It was assessed as a standalone event. Aftershocks were monitored. The system continued operating. 2 days later, the magnitude 9. 0 arrived. In retrospect, the March 9th event was a foreshock. At the time, in real time, with the best seismic monitoring system on Earth pointing at it, it was indistinguishable from the event it preceded. This week's earthquake, or the biggest of the year, is being assessed right now by JMA scientists using the same tools that assessed the March 9th event in 2011. The same tools, the same limitation. The assessment cannot tell you whether this week's earthquake is the event or the preparation for one. To understand why this week's earthquake demands more than routine attention, you need a map, not of Japan, of the seafloor south of Japan. Beneath the Pacific Ocean, running roughly 700 kilometers from the Kii Peninsula to the island of Kyushu, sits the Nankai Trough, a subduction zone. the Philippine Sea Plate diving beneath the Eurasian Plate at approximately 4 to 6 centimeters per year. The Nankai Trough has produced megathrust earthquakes at intervals of 90 to 200 years throughout recorded Japanese history. Not occasionally, regularly. The 1944 Tonankai earthquake, the 1946 Nankai earthquake. Both magnitude 8 or greater, both within 2 years of each other. Both generated tsunamis that struck Japan's Pacific coast. The last full rupture of the Nankai Trough, a simultaneous rupture of its eastern and western segments, occurred in 1707, the 1707 Hoi earthquake. Estimated magnitude 8, 6 to 9. 0. The tsunamis from that rupture reached heights of 25 meters in some coastal areas. And then, 49 days later, Mount Fuji erupted. The 1707 Hoi earthquake is believed to have triggered the eruption of Mount Fuji, the last time Fuji erupted, through the stress changes it produced in the crust beneath the volcano. The last full Nankai rupture triggered a volcano. That was 318 years ago. The Nankai Trough has not produced a full rupture since. The Japanese government's own Central Disaster Management Council has published its assessment of the next Nankai Trough megathrust event. The projected magnitude, 8, 0 to 9. 1. The projected death toll, up to 323,000 people. That number, 323,000, is not a worst-case fringe scenario. It is the Japanese government's own official projection, published, updated, publicly available. And this week's earthquake, the biggest of the year, occurred in a region where the stress pattern on the adjacent fault system is being examined in direct relation to Nankai Trough loading. Not confirmed as related, not dismissed as unrelated, examined. Let's go back to 3 seconds. The Earthquake Early Warning System, EEW, was built on a fundamental physics insight. Earthquakes produce 2 types of waves. P waves, primary waves, travel faster. They arrive first. They cause relatively minor shaking. They're detectable before the damaging waves arrive. S waves, secondary waves, travel slower. They arrive second. They cause the significant shaking that collapses structures, ruptures pipes, derails trains, and kills people. The gap between P wave arrival and S wave arrival is the warning window. It is measured in seconds. At 100 kilometers from the epicenter, approximately 20 to 30 seconds. At 50 kilometers, 10 to 15 seconds. At 10 kilometers, 3 seconds, 3 seconds for communities directly above the fault rupture. The EEW system detects the P wave, calculates magnitude and location, and issues the alert before the S wave arrives. For communities at distance, that alert is valuable. Automated systems respond, trains break, elevators stop at the nearest floor, gas cutoffs activate, surgeons withdraw from incisions, factory floors shut down. But for the communities closest to the rupture, the ones directly above where the fault moved, the warning arrives with 3 seconds to spare. And the buildings in those communities, the ones closest to this week's epicenter, are not uniformly the newest, the best engineered, the most seismically retrofitted structures in Japan. Japan's modern building codes, updated significantly after 1995, after the great Hanshin earthquake that killed 6,134 people in Kobe, are among the most stringent seismic codes in the world. Structures built under those codes performed this week. But Japan's building stock is not uniformly modern. Rural communities, older residential structures, pre-1981 construction, the 1981 code revision is the benchmark for modern seismic design. Those structures do not perform the way a post-2000 building performs in the same shaking. The 3-second warning saves the automated systems. It does not save the building that was built in 1970. Here is what the JMA has said publicly since the earthquake. Magnitude confirmed. Epicenter located. Tsunami warning issued, then lifted. Aftershocks expected. Continue to be vigilant. That language is accurate. It is calibrated. It is what a responsible agency says when the data supports elevated caution but not elevated alarm. Here is what the JMA has not said publicly, because saying it publicly has consequences that the agency has to weigh carefully. The aftershock sequence from this week's earthquake is being monitored not just as an aftershock sequence. It is being monitored against the stress map of the Nankai Trough. Every aftershock is being plotted on a stress transfer model, a calculation of how the stress released by the main shock has redistributed to adjacent fault segments. Some of those adjacent segments are Nankai Trough segments. The stress transfer calculation does not predict that the Nankai Trough will rupture this week. It does not predict that it will rupture this year. What it does, what it is designed to do, is tell scientists whether the segments of the Nankai Trough that were approaching their loading threshold before this week's earthquake are now marginally closer to it or marginally further from it. Closer, in most stress transfer models, means a fractional increase in the conditional probability of Nankai Trough rupture in the coming years. Fractional, not dramatic, not imminently alarming, but real, measurable, added to a system that was already at an elevated probability state before this week. The JMA does not publish that stress transfer calculation in its public bulletins, because the difference between Nankai Trough probability marginally elevated and Nankai Trough about to erupt in public communication is a gap that the general public does not reliably maintain. And the consequences of misinterpreting that gap, of treating a marginal probability adjustment as an imminent catastrophe warning, can cause harm of a different kind. So the calculation exists. The scientists run it. The bulletin does not include it. And the people who most need to understand the difference between this week's earthquake and the Nankai Trough mostly don't know the calculation is happening. Start at the epicenter. The main shock triggers automated responses across Japan's infrastructure. Shinkansen braking, elevator stops, factory shutdowns, nuclear plant scram procedures, the automatic shutdown of reactors, at facilities within the shaking radius. Japan operates 33 currently active nuclear reactors, following the restart of plants after the post-Fukushima shutdown period. Each one has seismic trip systems, acceleration thresholds that trigger automatic shutdown when shaking exceeds design limits. This week's earthquake triggered scram procedures at facilities within its radius. The plants shut down safely. The systems worked, backup power activated. That is the headline that did not appear in international coverage, because it is a success story, not a crisis. But the scram procedures that activated safely this week are the same procedures that activated at Fukushima Daiichi on March 11, 2011. The reactors shut down safely then too. What followed, the cooling system failure, driven by the tsunami that arrived 41 minutes after the earthquake, was not a reactor problem. It was a tsunami problem that became a reactor problem. Japan's Pacific Coast nuclear facilities are designed with seismic safety as the primary consideration. Tsunami safety, after 2011, has been substantially upgraded, but the question that every scram activation this week forces back into focus is whether the tsunami models for those facilities are calibrated to the right event. Not to the biggest earthquake of the year, to the Nankai Trough megathrust. Move outward. Japan's Pacific coast generates approximately 15% of Japan's total economic output. The coastal industrial corridor, petrochemical plants, ports, manufacturing hubs, from Shizuoka to Osaka, sits within the projected inundation zone of a Nankai Trough megathrust tsunami. Every week that passes without that event is a week in which the economic exposure of that coastal corridor accumulates further. Move outward further. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, operated jointly by NOAA and international partners, monitors seismic events in the Pacific for tsunami generation potential. This week's earthquake triggered an initial tsunami advisory that was subsequently lifted. The monitoring system worked. The advisory was accurate. The all-clear was appropriate. But the same monitoring system that issues advisories for Japan also issues advisories for Hawaii, for the Philippines, for Indonesia, for every Pacific coast that would receive a Nankai Trough tsunami within hours of the main event. The communication chain for a Nankai megathrust event, 323,000 Japanese casualties plus a trans-Pacific tsunami, is the most consequential test the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center has not yet had to run in the modern era. This week was a drill. Unannounced, unscripted, real. Here's the historical anchor that reframes this week. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake is studied globally as the defining modern case study in earthquake and tsunami disaster. It produced lessons, real ones, implemented ones. Seawall construction along the Tohoku coast, some sections reaching 15 meters, the largest coastal defense infrastructure project in Japanese history. Tsunami inundation maps, revised, updated, distributed to every coastal municipality. Evacuation route, signage, designated high ground areas, community evacuation drills in the Tohoku region, monthly in some communities. Fukushima Daiichi and every subsequent nuclear plant assessment revised tsunami wall heights based on the 2011 inundation data. These are not theoretical reforms. They exist. They are built. They are practiced. And here is what 2011 did not teach, what it could not teach, because its lesson was specific to its geography. The Tohoku earthquake ruptured the Japan Trench, the subduction zone off Japan's northeastern Pacific coast. The Nankai Trough is a different subduction zone, a different fault geometry, a different coastal exposure. The tsunami from a Nankai megathrust does not arrive at the Tohoku coast. It arrives at Japan's southern Pacific coast, Shizuoka, Aichi, Mie, Wakayama, Tokushima, Kochi. Coastal prefectures that experienced significant shaking from 2011, but not the tsunami. Coastal prefectures where the seawall construction has not proceeded at the same pace as Tohoku, where the cultural memory of living inside a tsunami warning is less immediate, where the evacuation drills are less frequent. The lesson that 2011 taught was taught to the coast that got the tsunami. The coast that will get the next tsunami, the Nankai coast, received the earthquake in 2011, not the wave. and the absence of the wave in 2011 for that Ost line has created a familiarity with disaster-adjacent experience that is different from actual inundation experience. The difference matters when the warning arrives, and the question is, do we go or do we wait? The communities that got the wave in 2011 do not wait anymore. The communities that will get the wave from Nankai, many of them have not decided yet. There are 3 ways to read the biggest earthquake of the year and the aftershocks still arriving. The earthquake this week is a moderate to large interplate event on a segment of Japan's complex fault system. The aftershock sequence is developing normally, following the modified Omori law, which describes how aftershock rates decay over time following a main shock. The sequence will continue for weeks to months, gradually declining in frequency and in the magnitude of the largest aftershocks. The stress transferred to adjacent segments, including Nankai Trough segments, is within the range of routine inter-event stress redistribution. It does not meaningfully change the Nankai Trough's short-term rupture probability. This week's earthquake is the event for this sequence, not a foreshock. The JMA monitoring data as it accumulates over the next 2 to 4 weeks will confirm this interpretation if the sequence decays normally. Its weakness. This is precisely what the monitoring data looked like for the March 9th, 2011 event. In the 2 days before the foreshock interpretation became unavoidable, the earthquake this week occurred on a fault segment that shares stress coupling with the deeper Nankai Trough interface. The stress released by this week's event has not simply diffused, it has transferred to adjacent shallow fault segments in the immediate aftershock zone, and at a lower magnitude to the deeper interface. The stress transfer does not predict Nankai rupture, but it has fractionally elevated the conditional probability of Nankai activation within a decade scale window, fractionally elevated from an already elevated baseline, 318 years since the last full rupture, 90 to 200-year average recurrence, is not a number that any seismologist will state publicly in a bulletin. It is a number that exists in the models, in the calculations that are running at the National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience in Tsukuba right now. Under this interpretation, this week's earthquake matters less as an event and more as an increment, one more data point added to the loading curve of a fault system that the Japanese government has already decided will produce 323,000 deaths when it ruptures. The question is not if, it is only how much closer. This is the interpretation that cannot be confirmed until it is no longer the interpretation, until it is the history. Under this reading, the aftershock sequence developing now is not a normal decaying sequence. One event in that sequence, not today, not necessarily tomorrow, will be larger than the main shock. At which point, the terminology changes, and what was called the main shock is reclassified as a foreshock. What was called an aftershock is reclassified as the main event. And the earthquake early warning system, the one that gave communities 3 seconds for this week's event, reactivates for the larger one, with different amplitudes, different shaking intensities, different infrastructure outcomes. This is not the probable interpretation. Most earthquake sequences do not include a larger subsequent event. The Gutenberg-Richter relation, the statistical law describing earthquake frequency and magnitude, predicts that for every magnitude, 7 earthquake. There are roughly 10 magnitude 6 events and roughly 100 magnitude 5 events. The law runs in both directions. The probability of an earthquake larger than the main shock decreasing rapidly with time. Most aftershock sequences decay. They do not escalate, but most is not all. And in Japan, on a fault system adjacent to the Nankai Trough, in the 318th year since the last full Nankai rupture, most is the statistical comfort that 2011 also offered on March 9th. Here is what the JMA knows with certainty. The magnitude of this week's earthquake, the location, the depth, the aftershock sequence as it has developed so far. Here is what the JMA knows with high confidence but cannot state publicly in terms that the general public can receive without misinterpretation. The probability that this event was a foreshock to something larger is greater than 0 and cannot be reduced to 0 by any monitoring data currently available. Here is what the JMA genuinely does not know. Whether this week's stress transfer to the Nankai Trough interface represents a meaningful change in the system's state or a perturbation within the existing uncertainty range of Nankai loading models. Whether the aftershock sequence now being recorded will decay normally, or whether it will produce an anomalous event that redefines the sequence. Whether this week's earthquake is one data point in a decades-long loading curve, or whether it is a signal that the loading curve has reached a new slope. Now, these are not rhetorical unknowns. They are the actual questions that the National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience, the Japan Seismic Hazard Information Station, and the JMA itself are working with in their post-event analyses. The analyses will take weeks. The aftershocks will not wait for them. And somewhere in the sequence of earthquakes still arriving in the JMA's network, each one time-stamped, each one located, each one assessed against the stress map of a fault system that the Japanese government has already calculated, will kill 323,000 people when it fully ruptures. The answer to the real question is accumulating. Not visibly, not in any bulletin. In the data, in the gap between what the instruments record and what they can conclude. Let's go back to the seismograph, the JMA monitoring room, somewhere in Tokyo. Screens displaying the National Seismometer Network. Each station a point on a map. The waveforms from this week's main shock have been analyzed, filed, published. The waveforms from the aftershocks are still arriving. Each one assessed, each one located. Each one added to the sequence that will be studied for months. Looking for the thing that the sequence either is or is not. The pattern of a standalone event resolving, or the pattern of something still building. The scientists reading those waveforms know both patterns. They have studied both. They have written papers on both. And in real time, in the hours and days after Japan's biggest earthquake of the year, they cannot yet tell you which pattern this is, because the patterns are indistinguishable until they separate. Outside the monitoring room, Japan continues. The Shinkansen that braked during the main shock resumed service within the hour. The inspection crews cleared the tracks. The scheduling system resequenced the departures. Trains are running at 320 km/h on tracks that were shaking hours ago. That is not recklessness. That is Japan, a country that has built its entire infrastructure, physical, institutional, cultural, around the fact that the ground moves here, that it has always moved here, that it will always move here. Because Japan sits on the junction of 4 plates. Because the Philippine Sea Plate will not stop subducting beneath Eurasia because a train schedule depends on it. The Nankai Trough has been loading since 1707. It loaded through the Meiji Restoration, through the Second World War, through the economic miracle, through 1995, and through 2011. It is loading right now, 318 years of accumulated stress at 4 to 6 centimeters per year, while the aftershocks from this week's earthquake continue arriving in the JMA's network. The biggest earthquake of the year has been named. The seismograph is already drawing the next line, whether that next line is the last aftershock of this sequence, or the first signal of something the sequence was preparing for. The instruments will record it before the wall does. 3 seconds, maybe 20, maybe 30. However long the physics allows between P wave and S wave at whatever distance the next rupture originates. The system will send the alert. Japan will respond the way Japan responds, because it has been responding to this ground for longer than any monitoring network has existed to watch it. The aftershocks are still coming, the Nankai Trough is still loading, and the seismograph in the JMA monitoring room is still drawing its line, 1 event at a time, 1 second at a time, in a country that has learned to read the ground because the ground has never stopped teaching.